Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please confirm me if you can hear me. If you can hear me, please indicate by showing a thumbs up, so that I know that we are or on one page. Can you all hear me now? Good evening.
Yeah.
Great. All right, great. Thank you, Sunday Jennifer. Thank you. All right. So good evening. Apologies for starting a bit late. I've been trying to sort a lot of things. At first, it was network, and then I didn't know what it was again. But I'm glad we are now on the same page. So can you see my screen, please? Confirm you can see my screen and let me know what it is you see I'm sharing.
So we can see your screen.
Okay, so what's the screen showing, please?
Introduction.
Great. All right, so thank you all very much for joining. My name is Oche Paul. I'll be your guide. I call myself a guide because it's very possible that a great number of you here have been introduced or are actually very savvy concerning the subject matter. We're looking at a 10-module track, and the first track is Introduction to Ethical Hacking, which is actually more or less penetration testing. Now, a lot of people have actually misconstrued what ethical hacking is, or as it were, they call hacking, as it were, some form of nebulous or perhaps a very dubious way of approaching a network. However, hacking is simply, in plain terms, tampering with what exists. About what exists, we're looking at a network, an application, and hardware, as the case may be. So hacking is actually not bad. It only depends on the perspective that you are engaging it from. So I'm going to attempt at the beginning here to give you maybe perhaps say 7 items before we dive into the curriculum. 7 items that are more or less what I consider the components of ethical hacking. All right. So you may need to write it down. The recording is also going to be made available. One of the first things that anybody will need to consider with regards to ethical hacking is what we call recon or reconnaissance. More or less, this is being able to gather information from a target object. This target object could be an application, could be a hardware, could be a network, as the case may be, because all hackers actually have different aspects that they focus on, right? So it could be an active reconnaissance or it could be passive reconnaissance. Now, some people actually mistake this reconnaissance for scanning. It is not. Reconnaissance is more or less just gathering intel. Just keep gathering intel. Another component of ethical hacking is scanning. Scanning, of course, is just from the word, is being able to just go through whatever you're looking at. Perhaps it could be ports or network. You are looking for something. You go through it and trying to identify a particular object you're searching for. You could do port scanning, you could do network scanning, you could do vulnerability scanning. Vulnerability is more or less a weakness that exists in a structure. And this structure could be software, network, hardware, as the case may be. Another thing is, which is the component of ethical hacking, is access, or let's put it this way, gaining access, right? This is where after you've been able to gather your intelligence, right, you've been able to scan for the available vulnerabilities that exist, you launch in or perhaps, gain access to be able to sit there. You exploit vulnerabilities that you're able to find. You usually perhaps could be, being able to use a compromise that is in the system. Could be the person, an application, as the case may be. These are all components of ethical hacking, and we'll deal with them in detail as we advance. Another thing is, having gained access, some smart network might kick you out. What you want to do is to be able to maintain your access, right? There's a video I'm going to show us as time goes by, not today, maybe tomorrow in our tomorrow class. It's an old video, but it captures all of what I'm talking about, right? So gaining access is number 3. Number 4 is maintaining access. This is where after you've gained access, you want to be able to establish a persistent connection so that you see how long you can maintain that control or the access. Usually is unauthorized access, or perhaps access that is authorized based on the papers that were signed, right? So you want to maintain the access. Number 4. Number 5, what you're looking at is analysis and reporting. I would have loved to separate the both of them, but you cannot do analysis without coming up with a report. So analysis is very important, more or less documenting all findings as regards vulnerabilities. You also want to document the methods that you use in doing the hacking, or what we call penetration testing. right? You want to also be able to provide what is considered an actionable recommendation. And this actionable recommendation will help the organization to be able to strengthen whatever posture they have with regard to security. Okay. Then this one, I would say, it depends on how you gain. If you are an ethical guy, right, you don't need this point. But if you are not an ethical person, what you want to do is to cover your tracks, right? Generally, it is done in ethical hacking just to be able to let you know that this thing, you need to know how that is done so that when a bad guy is doing it, you're able to identify what the person is doing. So generally in ethical hacking, it's not permitted, but then of course you learn about it. There's what is called break out of jail. I'll give you a document much later. It's a legal document which you all have to see and perhaps sign and return, because that way you're going to be exposed to tools, and we're going to ask that you please don't use those tools to cause trouble. Well, we always say it at the beginning. We cannot really guarantee if you will or not. So covering your track is one. Then the last one is to be able to remediate, right? Which is more or less being able to implement the fixes or the tests or test that is recommended. You remember earlier I talked about being able to provide recommendation, actionable recommendation. The last one, you want to be able to apply those recommendations. So typically, as an ethical hacker, you want to be able to help implement the fixes or tests, everything that you've been able to identify. So these are the 6 or 7 components of ethical hacking. We'll go into them in detail, more or less understand that ethical hacking relies heavily on tools. Unfortunately, in this part of the world where we live, most of the tools are not what we build. Most of the tools that are used are stuff that we download or purchase, which means somebody has already done it. So we will not, as we grow in ethical hacking, we'll become what I consider strong ethical hackers when we start developing our own tools to be able to hack whatever environment. Could be software, network, hardware, as the case may be. All right. So having said that, let us kick off. So we're going to be looking at the introduction to ethical hacking, and what is more or less called penetration testing. We'll be looking at, we're looking at this content, understanding ethical hacking and penetration testing. This is where we're going to explain the importance of ethical hacking and penetration testing. We're going to be exploring penetration testing methodologies. This is where we're going to try to attempt to explain different types of penetration testing methodologies and frameworks. And why this is so is because ethical hacking has to be done against setting up approved or allowed standards. Otherwise, that's why it's called ethical hacking. What makes you now an ethical guy is that you follow ethics. Penetration or hacking is not wrong if you are following these standards or frameworks, right? We have different standards as it were in the whole world. Then we'll look finally at building your own lab. This is where we're going to, perhaps we'll do this lab at the beginning of tomorrow's class, where we are able to build our own virtual machine and use that for our class. Okay, so let's dive into the first part, which is understanding ethical hacking and penetration testing. Now, an ethical hacker, this is just like an overview. An ethical hacker is a person who acts as an attacker and evaluates the security posture of a network or systems infrastructure. Let me also add software structure, right? To be able to identify and possibly exploit the security weakness found and then determine if a compromise is possible. So you are more or less trying to certify that this thing, this network, this software is good to go. Now, this has actually happened. Most of the software that you see in most of the stores where you download the applications from, Microsoft Office, Play Store, Google Play Store, Apple Store, is Apple Store now, or most of the stores where you download the apps or applications from, right? Before those applications actually are put in those stores, the ethical hacker guys are called, and then they are given the task of testing it, more or less being able to verify if it passes the test of general use. So the process of being able to assume the posture of an attacker, right, and evaluating the security posture of whether the network, the software, or the system infrastructure is called penetration testing. And so we in our field right now understand that penetration testing is what people actually are selling as ethical hacking. Okay, so it is, and it's been in play. Most DevOps guys do this. Once you're able to develop an app, you want to find out whether it can withstand 1 or 2 possible attacks based on what you suspect could happen in the field. So ethical hacking is very, very, it's been around, just that it's gotten a new name. And of course, since hacking is happening, we want to add some ethics to it, and so that we can employ some people to say, hey, work with me. As long as you do it based on the standard of our organization, then of course you are considered a hacker, but then with ethics. Okay, so the key factor in defining ethical versus non-ethical hacking is that the non-ethical hacking guy involves malicious intent. He doesn't have any permission. He does it. I'm sure you've come across the three categories of hackers, right? Number one, there's the guy called the white hat hacker. There's also the guy called the gray hat hacker. And there's a guy called the black hat hacker. Of course, by the hat, we're simply indicating the intent that they have. So if somebody's wearing a white hat, the intent or the purported intent is to say the guy is good. Somebody's wearing a black hat, his intent is bad. Somebody's wearing a gray hat, he's what I call wear belle face. So it's more or less what drives him at that point is the interest that is most popular. So if he's actually more about, his intention, he can sell it to the white hat guy. If he's not, if he has grudges with you, he can sell it to the black guys. Okay. So the permission to attack is often referred to as the scope. Now, the scope of the test, which is more or less what you are allowed and not allowed to do, is very crucial, because without that, you may get into trouble. So identify the scope. So I walk into a place and I say, I'm an ethical hacker. What is actually the scope? I'm trying to test the software in the network. I just stick there. That's my scope. If it is the network infrastructure, I stay there. If it is the system infrastructure, I stay there, right? So a security researcher looking for vulnerabilities in products, application, or web services is considered an ethical hacker if he or she responsibly discloses those vulnerabilities to the vendor or owners of the targeted research. So there are lots of people. Notice sometimes, I'm sure you've come across it in your journey in IT, you must have come across some applications that some people allow you to install, and then they tell you that this is a hack, or this is it's hack. That's what they call it, yeah? This is the hack. You install it and then you run it in a certain mode, and then tell the application to not run updates and all of those. Now, those were the guys that were ethical. They were hackers back in the day, right? But now we're looking at allowing them sign certain documents so that whatever they do is disclosed to us. So every application, every hardware, before they are released to the market, they get ethical hackers to do it. It's like that with practically a lot of product. Right? Drugs, that happens with drugs. It happens with instruments. I know that Phil Collins, who's very, very old right now, I understand that when he started out as a musician, he was a drummer for a band, but eventually was now some guy that was signed for a particular company that before they release their drums to the market, they call him and ask him to play the drums. And whatever he tells them, they would adjust. That's because he's considered somebody who's got experience regarding drums. Right? You can lay that out on cars. There are certain people who drive certain cars. They called and they say, okay, look, we made this car, please drive it. And if the person drives the car, then you say, okay, we'll sign off on it that this car is great. Then we can release it to the market. So that's exactly what our ethical hackers are. They are these guys whose focus would be, like we identified, software, applications, web services, network infrastructure, hardware, and so on and so forth. Now, the same type of research performed by someone who then uses the same vulnerability to gain unauthorized access to a target network or system will be considered a non-ethical hacker. He does the same process. The only issue now is that he is not somebody who is giving back feedback, but is using it for his own malicious intent or perhaps his own gain. So someone who finds a vulnerability and discloses it publicly without working with the vendor is considered a non-ethical hacker. He's a bad guy. So we're looking at somebody having some level of discretion. So if you work on somebody's product, there's some level of discretion that allows you to, of course, inform the person, hey, guy, this thing get problem here. Solve them before you send it to the market. Okay? An ethical hacker uses the same tools as the non-ethical hacker. The same tool. The only difference now is that he's able to report back. So that means it's just like a gun, for example. The gun in the hand of somebody who's malicious intent is considered a bad instrument. He's a robber, he's a thief. But if it's in the hand of a law enforcement agent, right, all things being equal, then it's perhaps a good guy. So a law enforcement agent guy can walk around with his gun, right? Nobody is stressing. But somebody who's a robber cannot afford to be walking around with it, okay? So an ethical hacker typically reports the finding to the vendor or customer, and he or she is helping to make the network more secure, trying to avoid performing any tests or exploits that might be destructive in nature. Moving on, why do we need to do penetration testing or pen testing? right? Someone who is responsible for securing and defending a network system wants to find any possible path of compromise before the bad guys do. That's why we need ethical hackers. Over the years, many different defensive techniques such as antiviruses have been there, firewall, intrusion prevention system, anti-malware have been developed and implemented. And this was all in the bid to ensure that the bad guys don't get into your network. By the way, a firewall from our perspective is not a device. And even if it were a device, it is actually a device that has certain scripts written inside of it whose plan is to carry out some actions. Okay, so firewall could be a device, of course, only if you are new to the team. But if you've been on this particular path for a while, it would be wrong to perceive a firewall as just a device that you buy. And of course, even if you're a device that you buy, inside it, there are certain action that you're supposed to carry out, which have been pre-configured. And that's why I said that a firewall is a device that contains pre-written scripts whose job is to be able to identify some malicious stuff and prevent it. So how do we know if those defenses really work and whether they are enough to keep out the bad guy? That in itself is the reason why we need ethical hackers. Now, how valuable is the data that we are protecting? By the way, let's also say this. Everything that we are attempting to protect from the bad guys is referred to as asset. An asset. Please confirm if you can hear me. Can you hear me? It appears that I'm having some problems. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you, sir.
Okay, super. Thank you. I wanted to be sure because the place been quiet too much. I can't do anything that happen.
Yeah, we can.
So what? Okay, thank you. Whatever is
like you had a singular slide ever since.
Yes. You've been on slide 1 ever since.
No, I've moved though.
We have not been seeing you moving.
You have not seen my screen at all.
Yeah, your slides are in that slide 1.
What's on slide 1? Let me know what's on slide 1. What's the title?
Introduction to
Introduction of ethical hacking and penetrating testing.
Introduction to ethical hacking.
All right, let me stop sharing and resume sharing again. Let's see. I can see familiar faces. So let me attempt sharing again. What about now?
It's booting now. Okay.
So what are you seeing now?
Why do we need this?
Why do we need to do penetrating testing?
Super, that's where I'm at. Great. So where I want. So is this still the same thing you're seeing now?
Yes, we are seeing it now.
Great. Thank you. So there are some questions that would be answered by a penetration test as per, do I need this application? Is it what is needed? Do I need this service in the network? Is it what is needed? Do I need this particular device? Is it what is needed? Is it posing a threat? Is it positioned rightly? Should it be somewhere? Imagine having to require the services of a bouncer, of a policeman, and of a dog. So the question will be, all of these guys are security tips or security tools. Where do I place which? Do I place the dog first before I place the military man, before I place the bouncer? Or do I place the bouncer first, then place the dog, then place the military man, and so on? So all of this is why you need a penetration testing guy. So we walk into the place, do a test of the network, and then be able to advise. So we need to determine what it is we are protecting. Everything that is of value to you in an organization is considered an asset. Could be a software, could be a hardware, could be your infrastructure, but it is your place to identify what you consider an asset, then invite or train or employ an ethical hacker to do the job of finding out how secure that thing is. Simply implementing a firewall, an IPS, an anti-malware, a VPN, a web application, firewall, and other modern security defenses is not enough. So it's not also enough to just buy gadgets and put, okay, or buy applications and put, or buy services. You want to find out from the mouth of the professional, what exactly do we need this for? You also need to test the validity of each of the things that you're using. How valid is it? How important is it? How useful is it? And you need to do this on a regular basis because network and system change constantly. Now, this is what we mean by network and system change constantly. The landscape of our network, as it were, whether it is internet or intranet, right, evolves with the introduction of different technologies. They keep evolving. What they were, I bet you, what they were in January is not what they are today. So you need somebody who is constantly with the skill, constantly testing to find out whether one or two things has happened to either the structure of the application and so on. Let me also put this way. Sometimes, right, if I put a product, if I develop a product and I put it on the shelf and nobody picks it to use it, understand that the product was developed. Let's assume the product was developed in February. If the product was developed in February, the product has the state-of-the-art defense system for February. They guarantee that it can outlive or outdo any form of attack after February is not given. It was developed with February in mind. So should I purchase that particular product in August, there will be a need for me to identify whether it is fit for the landscape that we live in August. So you need a penetration testing guy, right? So the attack surface can change as well. And when it does, you need to consider reevaluating your security posture by way of testing the application. So whatever traffic is going to be going through the network would have to penetrate different devices. So I want to be able to use tools to find out that if somebody were to approach my network using a malicious software or tool, how far can they go in the network? So that's why we have penetration testing. There's a lab that you have, which is more or less like a research, just being able to research pen testing careers, right? So let's look at, brings us to threat actors. What are threat actors? Anybody, right, who carries out an action that can harm my asset is a threat actor. Anybody who carries out any form of action and that action can harm my asset, the person is a threat actor. So more or less, we call them the malicious guys, people who are attacking network. Now, we're putting two words together, malicious attacker. There's no attacker that is not malicious. Once an attacker is there, he's malicious. So better put, we'll say, perhaps to be able to tell you the strength of the person's effect. That's why we call it the malicious attacker, right? So these are different types of the attackers. Number one, organized crimes. Now, organized crime goes where the money is. It consists of well-funded and motivated groups that will typically use any and all of the latest techniques to be able to compromise the system. Whether that is ransomware or data theft or identity theft or whatever, it is a monetized approach where they know that a particular action allows them access to the money, or let's put it this way, to the currency, right? And it's usually not one person who does it. It's a group of people who have a buy-in into it. And there's a saying, I'm a Hausa guy. For those of you who are not from the north, when I say I'm a Hausa guy, I grew up in the north, and so the lingua that is more very readily available to me is the Hausa. There's a saying in Hausa that says, "Ba a chingari se de dangari," that you cannot conquer a city except you have someone on the inside who has a buy-in. That's like putting it the transliteration. In Yoruba language, it says "kokoro tonjefo, idie right? Suggesting that the thing that chops the vegetable, they close it to the vegetable. I don't know how they say it in Igbo language, so please permit me, the Igbo guys. I'll try and learn it so that when next I run a class, I'll have to use the Hausa one. But more or less, it's simply saying that any crime that happens, right, in a situation where the target is we are looking at currency, we want to get some form of thing to benefit us, it is an organized crime. Then we have hacktivists. Hacktivists are more or less hackers, right, who are posing as activists. Their own motivation is not money, right? They're looking to make a point and to be able to ensure that they sell a particular belief, right? So they use crime, cyber crimes, as their method of attack. Now, how many of you know about Anonymous? That's one guy. That's one group of people, right? The type of attack that they carry out is they steal sensitive data and then reveal it to the public. They say, like, Anonymous will tell you, hey, an attack is going to happen, so blah, blah, blah. They just shall have access to people's assets. And then they get those assets and be able to now tell you that, hey, this thing is bad, and so on and so forth. Then there's state-sponsored attackers, which is what's beginning to happen in the world today. State-sponsored. A state is more or less, how do I put it? Well, it's a state. A state is a state. I wanted to say it's an organized entity. Yeah, an organized entity backed by law as a state. Now, those organized entities backed by law are beginning to sponsor a lot of these attacks. Governments around the world today use cyber attack, and they use that to steal a lot of information against their opponent to be able to cause disruption. It is either economic, it is military, it is it could be health related as much as possible. So it's state sponsored. Then there's insider threat. Usually from the organization, there are often normal employees who are tricked into giving out sensitive information, or perhaps they can mistakenly click on a link. Sometimes they know, sometimes they don't. But we have to treat them as if they know. So, however, they could also be malicious insiders who are possibly motivated by revenge. You just vex. You have not promoted me for some time now. Let me mess your network up. I can see how much they're generating, and then they are paying me peanuts and so on. So there are people like that. So these are the categories: organized crimes, hacktivists, state-sponsored attackers, and then insider threats. So let's get exploring penetration testing methodologies. We're going to be looking at the various framework that exist. There is more to penetration testing than hacking. Okay, now hacking is good. Hacking, if you ask me, is the beginning of penetration testing, or as it were, of ethical hacking, because you want to now be able to test the strength of.
Sorry, quick one. I think you're still on just one slide.
But that's which of the slide now?
One slide. Still on the why do we need to do penetration testing?
Okay, so let me do it this way. You know what? Let me do it this way. So let me know what I'm sharing. Are you seeing anything right now?
Yeah, your name, Oche Paul.
Okay, how about now? How about now?
Okay, yeah, threat actors.
Okay. Apologies. So this is where we are right now. What are you seeing now?
Exploring. Okay. Overview.
Great.
Exploring penetration testing methodologies. Yeah.
I think I'll stick with it this way so that I don't, because it appears that each time I expand my screen to share, I lose sending that. So there's more to penetration testing than hacking. Okay, hacking is good, but it's the beginning, is the base. Let's start from there. Now, penetration testing, like we say, we want to find out how far a particular service, a particular tool, a particular application, a particular hardware can stay without being compromised. That is the penetration testing. So we need tools. Okay. Now, a haphazard approach will result in haphazard result. We agree. It is important to follow well-known methods. These methods are based on ensuring that we do not have issues, because the moment somebody is approaching some form of practice without a standard, the person is considered rogue. That is why we need to have regulations around the world. Otherwise, it will just be anyhow. And we don't want people acting anyhow. So because of that, we want to ensure that people follow methods and standard as an approach of engaging any form of practice as far as ethical hacking goes. And because it is standardized, there must be a systematic way to approach it. So give or take, we're looking at exposing us to those frameworks that exist and is accepted or acceptable worldwide. You should understand the major documented methodologies and standards so that you can create a strategy that draws on the strength of those standards. Documenting your approach with the methodologies and standards that you used also provides, very importantly, accountability for the organization that you work with, especially you're trying to help them make results defensible in case issues arise with the customer or arises with the state or arises with the organization. You want to ensure that you have records. When they hold you, you can say, CMO, I signed so-and-so document and the scope captured that we should go this far. We went that far and these were the things that we found. Based on the things that we found, we're recommending this and this. Now they've turned their back to say that they didn't employ our services. So very, very importantly, it's very important to have documents signed and to also follow these standards. The process of completing a penetration testing varies based on a lot of factors. Again, what we're going to look at is what's expected. It's not different from the approach that medics or surgeons use when they go to the theater. Of course, they have standard of how to approach a particular ailment or a particular surgery process. However, based on the factors they have on ground, they may decide to jump to step 4 or come back to step 1 if they have, let's say, steps 1 to 7. Okay, so but it's important to go through the steps. The tools and techniques used to access the security posture of a network or system also vary. Okay, so an organization that is owned by the government, the approach is different. An organization that is privately owned is different. An organization owned by mafia is different. An organization owned by just finance, right? Private sector finance guys, the approach is different. However, there's a standard, which is why most times, most of them want to have you certified. Once you are certified, they know that they can hold you accountable, right? So the networks and systems being evaluated are often highly complex, agreed. Complex in the sense that it is usually never the same with different organizations, right? So that's why standard is very important. Even with deployed networks, standard needs to be followed. Once networks are deployed and standards are followed, approaching solving a problem with regards to penetration testing is actually easier because you are going to follow with standard. Because of this, it is very easy when performing a penetration testing to go off scope. If you don't have all of this framework, you can go off scope. Remember that the scope is the area that you have permission to work on, right? So this is where testing methodologies come in. Now, why do we need to follow methodology for penetration testing? Number one, scope is, let's put it, scope creep is one reason for utilizing specific methodology. Why? Somebody can creep into a scope, an area where they are not given permission. For instance, when performing a penetration testing for a customer, you must show the method you plan to use for testing and let the person understand it's tried and true. It is based on this organization. This standard is approved by SANS, is approved by MITRE, is approved by different organizations, right? Different frameworks. By utilizing a known methodology, you are able to provide documentation of a specialized procedure that has been used many times before by different people in different aspects or different parts of the world. So these are considerations. Number one, your network infrastructure. Number two, application-based. Number three, testing cloud services, being able to test it. Several different types of testing are often combined in the overall scope of a penetration testing, but they can also be performed as individual tests as well. A list of most common environmental considerations for the types of penetration testing today are network infrastructure tests, like I was explaining earlier. It could be that we're looking at perhaps, say, your actual network infrastructure, which is the devices that we have. By the way, the recommended approach for deploying any form of network architecture with respect to security should be defense in depth. Let me use this analogy. If you live in an estate and you only rely on the gate leading to the estate and the security at that gate, then you're of all men most miserable. What do you want to do? The gate to the estate will have its security. Then each street should have their own security. Then the gate to your house should have its security. Then the houses in the compound should have their security. The main door to the house, security. Then each door to every room has security. So that means if you're looking at the approach of defense with respect to network infrastructure and security implemented, you are counting gate to estate, gate to the street, gate to the compound, gate door to your own house, door to your own room, and so on. That way, you approach the defense in depth, not just depending on the one at the gateway. Now, let's take that concept now and bring it to network infrastructure. So you can have a default gateway at your network deployment. Now, you want to look at every device and every sector of the network, right? From the gateway to the DMZ, to your core, to your distribution layer, to your access layer. You must implement every form of security required for that layer. After you're done with the access layer, every host must have its own. And these are all captured in the policy of the organization. Now, that's something I've mentioned now that I'm going to get to much later. It's very important. Unfortunately, most organizations do not have a policy. They don't have. They don't have. It's just usually the policy is driven by one bad guy that is the head of the network. If he no day, nothing they work. Once in show, the guy don't show, network will flow or security will show. But you want to have a policy so that should the guy not be around or the person is around, that thing is standard. Okay. So we're looking at the infrastructure of all your network to include things like switches, routers, firewall devices, supporting resources. Maybe you have servers like your AAA servers who do authentication, authorization, and accounting, intrusion prevention systems, and so on. You can even have your wireless access points. right? Very important. I'll show you the video I was talking about. Some of you have seen it before, but the video is very important. I will attempt to analyze it, right? Somebody has a question? Okay, I thought somebody has a question.
No.
Okay, all right. The other thing is the application. This usually just focuses on the strength or weaknesses of applications that are deployed. And these applications are not just not user applications. We're looking at enterprise applications. What do we mean by that? Applications that organizations use. Maybe it's a finance organization. Let's take, for example, revenue services of a particular state. What applications do they have that they use with regards to how to receive revenue or how to disburse their services and all of those stuff? What interactions do they have with other agencies as regards, taxing or perhaps even levying and so on and so forth? These applications are peculiar to them. Now, these applications may be used by just them, but we want to find out what is the level of weakness that they may have. How valid are these applications? So you want to run a penetration testing for those application-based services. Right? So these weaknesses can include, but they are not limited to perhaps misconfigurations, right? What we call input validation, injection issues, logic flaws, and so on, right? So want to identify. It focuses on largely identifying that these devices or these services, these particular applications are not subject to being infiltrated or eroded. Now let's go back a little. Something happened some 2 weeks ago. Some of you were perhaps affected by it. There are certain banks in our country. I'm not going to mention any names, but as I'm speaking, I know you all being interactive with your environment can tell. Certain banks had some issues, and there were no prior notice. Matter of fact, the notices were given shabbily. For some reason, people could not access their applications. They could not access their resources that were in the banks. Only for us to go and find out and realize that, oh, they were implementing a particular higher level of the application which they are using, and it required them, doing it face by face, but they didn't anticipate that it was going to be that disastrous. And so a lot of people were blocked for about 3 to 4 days. Right? So more or less what they did was to do a testing on what they were using before. And I think they said that what they're using is Finacle 10, that they're using Finacle something before, but they were migrating to Finacle 10. And for some reason in deploying it, so and so issues happen. A particular bank had to release a statement yesterday to say, no, this statement you are talking about, we closing our services, no be so, we're only doing it for a particular set of customers and all of those stuff. More or less, they invited the services of these pen testing guys who identified that what they were using were perhaps compromised or did not suffice for the current network security or cyber security landscape. So they needed to upgrade it to what had certain modules that could prevent any of these attacks, right? So that's application-based testing. Then there's for the cloud, and you all know that a lot of people are moving to the cloud now, which is the next thing. Cloud, of course, the concept is more or less being able to have your resources, whatever the resources are. And this cloud is quite large. It could be software, it could be platform, it could be, it should be plenty. But you have some certain services, but you don't have them physically located at your place. So each time you need to access them, you need the services of those providers by going through the internet and accessing these services out there. Some of them require that you put some of your assets in the cloud. Now, what you want to be able to identify is to ensure that the cloud itself is secure, right? And it depends on the module or the model which you are using. Software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. Software as a service is SaaS, SaaS. PaaS is platform as a service. Then IaaS is infrastructure as a service. Regardless of the model that you're using, what you want to identify is that it is safe, right? So what you want to do is be sure that there are certain service level agreements that have been signed regarding the service that you're using. There's data integrity, very important, that the data that we're sending to the cloud is the same thing that it was when he left as when it went there. When I'm also pulling it down, it should be the same thing, right? And certain inscriptions that are there. So penetration testing would be a very good place, or ethical hacking would be a good next step after people have been able to identify, one, network, number two, network security. Then ethical hacking can make a lot of sense, right? So there are certain considerations you need to do. One, environmental consideration, very important. You want to find out the physical aspect of your environment, right? Is it physical? I think I was watching a movie, and they were waiting for, I don't know whether it's a movie or it was just my head. They had hired the services of a hacker. This hacker was not like a physical hacker, not software infrastructure, network infrastructure hacker. And they were sitting in the room upstairs waiting for the guy to come in. The guy knocks and enters into the place and tells them, you need to sack everybody who is here. So the next question was, how did you get in? So that's exactly my point. Everybody needs to be sacked. He did his own penetration testing by walking into the place and used social engineering to find out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things. And then also observe that most of the staff that live there are not educated. There's some level of tailgating happening. People, if you are going into a lift, you're supposed to use your own card, but he was so nice. Some people, they allowed their car to let him come in. Hello? Okay, I thought somebody was saying something. Okay, so it means nobody was, right? So more or less, he was able to do the testing and found out that, hey, there's a problem here. Your environment is very important. The type of test that you run in a physical parameter can help to expose the weakness in that place. Okay, another one could be social engineering, like phone calls, right? Emails. Some organizations now, we know, let's assume that, like, see what's happening now. There's a new appointment that's just happened in our federal executive sector. Some guys got some appointments, some got redeployed to different places. Now, imagine that an attacker just identifies, let's say, for example, they didn't touch finance. So let's say education, for example. The guy walks into the place, and knowing that a new guy has come, an attacker can walk in the place and say, you know what, let me generate a mail and send quickly without them knowing. So I cook a mail, and the mail looks like it is coming from the new minister of education. So you may carry minister. I don't know what nomenclature they have. Let's say it's minister.ministry.gov, right? I send a mail, and I send it to all staffers. Now, because all staffers don't have the education or perhaps the training that lets them understand that this is what it should look like. Typically, a mail from chief executive should be looking like this and like that. I can actually launch an attack, particularly during transitions. So the environment is very, very important, right? So people need to be educated on phone calls, on emails, on SMSs. You may have gotten some SMSs recently as part of as part of the political parties, what to make governance nice. The president has made available 85,000 naira. You qualify. Please call Lukman on this number. And some people actually place that call. Now, of course, we are in the field and we are savvy, so we will not fall for that. But then guess what? There are quite a number of people who fall for those kind of things. Imagine that those kind of people are in your organization. Can you imagine the level of compromise going to happen? So it is important to test how your employees handle all of this, right? Okay, they could be maybe not your employee, but should your services be engaged, you want to ensure that you educate everybody within the environment. So the type of test is often omitted, right? And sometimes when people run trainings, right, they run trainings only for the executives. They don't run training for the cleaners. Trainings are not run for the megadis, the security guys. Trainings not run for the technical guys that run the generator. I can walk into that place and come as somebody servicing generator and do what I need to do, right? So it is very, very important, right? It should not be to identify individuals who fail the test. It's just to identify the level of non-compliance that they have to the policies. That's why I said that to start with, organizations must have policies. Once they have a policy, then you can get employees to understand what the policy of the organization is, and then that way you can actually test compliance. I had an experience some years ago. I went to visit a friend. Then we're starting out. He was working then in Mobile. And being a friend of mine, I was able to get into his office. Number one, he was wrong. I shouldn't be in the office at that time. Number two, when he stepped out of the office, since it was a computer he had on his desktop, I attempted sitting on the desktop. Immediately, somebody walked in and told me, my friend, get up. I was wondering what's happening. Why are you being rude? And he started challenging me. Who are you? I said, what thing they happen? Not just computer, sit down. Why am I sitting there? What's my ID card? Am I a staff? I say, okay, what thing happened? Then my friend walks in. My friend almost lost his job simply because he didn't comply to the policy of the organization. Number one, I should not have been in the workplace at that time. Number two, I was in the workplace and I was in his office, which is wrong. I should be downstairs. Number three, I was in his office and then I sat on his desk and I was attempting to use his computer, and I'm not a staff. That in itself was a violation of their policy. These days, people can just walk into your office anytime and come to. I think you guys may have friends abroad and they tell you that sometimes you can't call them. They tell them at work. Their phones are kept away. You don't have the right to use your phone during certain office times, right? So these policies must be captured. And the reason why we're talking about this, how does that have to do with anything about penetration testing or ethical hacking? Well, it is when we're doing all of those tests, like we said, the environment, very key. Part of being able to do the first step, which is what I told you, which is reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, includes going into the place and being able to perhaps go through either of these stuff and get what I need. Okay, so a great tool for performing social engineering test campaign is SET, right? It was created by some guy called Dave Kennedy. It's a social engineer toolkit. Look that up. All right. So for environmental consideration, the terms below are used to describe the perspective from which the testing is performed. Number one, unknown environment. This simply means that the tester is typically provided only a very limited amount of information. So the tester will be provided only the perhaps domain name, IP addresses, and that will be the scope. However, the scope is a larger target. The idea of this type of limitation is to be able to have the tester, start out with the perspective that if somebody who's an external guy has only this information, what can he do? Okay, so that's one called unknown. Then there's known. This is typically where you give the person information about the organization. So things like the range of IP addresses, the network topology or the diagram, the layout. Then you also give the person configurations of the environment. Then if there are credentials that the person needs to use to log into those places, you give it to the person. That way, the scopes include being able to access certain applications within the environment. So the tester will be able to provide maybe source code of a particular application that you are targeting. Then he's able to look at the structure and then test it, maybe insert one or two lines, one or two commas to be able to see what can be done. Okay, and he's usually trying to identify a hole in the security of that particular application. Then the other one is partially known environment, which is more or less gray box. Okay, so somewhat like a hybrid of the both of them. So we can look at the unknown environment as the black box. That's where the bad guy is coming and he doesn't have too much information. Then the known environment is the white box. And then the partially known environment is considered the gray box. Right? So these are the standards and methodologies. Right? We'll look at MITRE. MITRE, MITRE ATT, and CK. Actually, the idea is just supposed to be attack. Okay. Now, several penetration testing methodologies have been around for a while, and they will keep updating them and keep upgrading them based on what the scope, the landscape of the network is, okay, or the internet is. So we have OSWAP, we have NIST, very popular, NIST SP, very popular. The ones that are not usually very popular, people don't talk about as much, are the MITRE and the OSWAP. That's the Web Security Testing Guide. Okay, so MITRE is an amazing source for learning about an adversary's tactics, his techniques, and his procedures, which is what we refer to as the TTP. So what is his technique? What are his tactics? What are his procedures? Naturally, if an attack is coming and the attack is perhaps a worm, what are the tactics? What are the techniques? What will be the procedure that they go about? If the attack is a malware that is perhaps a ransomware, what are the techniques? What are the tactics? Or what are the tactics? What are the techniques? What are the procedures? Now, and all of them are offensive, right? So, they are very mild testing. Some of them are offensive penetration testing. So usually what this does is used by security professionals, and typically they are using that to hunt teams, right? To be able to identify that this deployment, to what degree is it secure, right? Now, the MITRE guys, MITRE and attack has a combination of a collection of different matrices, different mutations or combinations of tactics and techniques, and also whatever sub-techniques or sub-tactics that they have. And they could include things like network attack, cloud attack, mobile attacks, attack matrix, and all, and the rest of them. It lists a technique or a detail, no, not a detail. It lists like a how do I put it now? Like a collection of tactics and techniques that if people or adversaries or threat actors are going to be using to penetrate or attack, constitute an attack, this is the approach. Remember, it is actually their TTP, their technique, their tactics, their techniques, and their procedure. Then the OSWAP is a comprehensive guide The focus here is just largely web application testing. Okay, so if what I'm looking at is web applications, OSWAP is my guy. Now for your NIST, it's usually is based on is a National Institute of Standard and Technology group, and it's actually based on it was originally, I think originally US Department of Defense, but handed over eventually to US Department of Commerce, right? It provides an organization with guidelines on planning and conducting information security testing, and it is like if you write let's put it this way, if you're writing any cybersecurity course or certification exam, and you have this NIST endorsement, then you can as much as apply for certain jobs within the governance of the United States. It's considered the industry standard in the United States for penetration testing, right? So it is a document that gives a guide. And remember, all of these are frameworks, right? So if we're looking at MITRE, OSWAP, or NIST, it depends on your scope, right? We also have the open source security technology methodology manual. This is used for that. This has been around. This is why I said that most hackers have been around and they've been using it for a while. They have what is called a security test audit report, which is what you're supposed to be able to as a report, the report of the open source security testing methodology, right? And it is a document that lays out what we can say consistent security testing, which can be repeated here and there. As it stands today, what we have is the version 3 and version 4, and version 4 is not yet what has been accepted because it's still in the draft state. Okay, so what it covers are things like, number one, operational security metrics to start with. If we're going to be operating, what are the metrics? What is the step? What should we use? What do we consider trust level? So we do some trust analysis. What's the workflow for this particular method of penetration testing? If we have humans involved, how do we get to identify those humans involved? How do I get to identify their levels of loyalty to the entire scope? So we have a human security testing, we have physical security testing of the environment. Of course, if you have wireless settings, wireless security implemented, there's wireless security testing. Let me put this to you, please. After class today, attempt to just go and check out all of these things. Read them. They would help enrich your scope, right, as regards penetration testing. Then we also have the Penetration Testing Execution Standard, which is the PTES. It has information about attacks and their methods, and it provides information on the latest tools that are available to accomplish the testing methods that are outlined. So typically what they have phases, right, in this particular framework or the method or the standard, as it were. It's not a framework, sorry, this is the standard. So they have phases. Number one is pre-engagement. Number 2 is intelligence gathering. Number 3 is modeling, or what they call threat modeling. Then number 4, after identifying the threat, you model the threat, you launch it. The threat is supposed to find out what weaknesses we have within there. So the next step comes, which is vulnerability analysis. Now that you found the vulnerability, which is the weakness in the structure of either the application, the network, or the infrastructure, what you want to do is to exploit. You exploit, that's where you launch what is called a payload, or you launch the attack against the network. After the exploitation, then you have post-exploitation. This is where you sit down and say, okay, now we've caused a problem. Problem has been caused on the network. The next thing is to look at what did it cause? Or these were the issues that we had. This application, this service was down, these people were affected and all. Then you do a reporting. This is where the reporting is very, very important, right? Now, the next one is the Information Security System Assessment Framework. It's a penetration testing methodology. And like the other ones, it lists some additional phases. It covers certain phases, right? Remember I told us earlier at the beginning, what I listed at the beginning as what every of these methods are capturing with respect to the components of penetration testing. So these guys have number 1, information gathering. Number 2, network mapping. Then vulnerability identification. Then penetration. Then gaining access and maintaining access, right? Where you have privilege escalation. Then you have enumerating further, compromising remote users, maintaining access, and then covering their tracks. So typically these are the ones that are available there. So there's a lab that you're going to be able to. That's why I said you attempt to, at the end of the class, try to compare, read and compare all of them. So as we come to an end today's class, building your own lab, what we're going to be doing is understand that it is important that you develop your skill. And hopefully within the next 9 chapters, we'll do a lot of it. Skills come with practice. I said that I was holding a class yesterday, I think, with some set of people, and I told them there's a lie that's being sold to a lot of people, and unfortunately, I'm within the system, but I don't buy it. And that's when somebody tells you that a particular training that lasts for 2 weeks would equip you. Now, lie. It gives you skills required. To become equipped, you have to go back and practice. And some of these practices come with some nights that you don't sleep. So more or less, you must put in your energy and put in time. It is work. You don't just read a book and know it all, right? So skills come with practice, but how can you practice if you don't have something to practice on? It is not possible for you to practice on client network and application. So what do? We can now create a simulation, right? And throughout this course, we have a setting, we have some open virtualization appliances, which is like simulation of operating systems for certain practices. Or we're going to create a virtual machine environment, import them, right? Now, remember that tools and techniques that are used in ethical hacking, right? These tools and techniques is what we use. They are tools, and how to use the tools is the next thing. So you can have a tool, I don't know how to do it. However, if I'm using my tool and technique on somebody's network, I can be apprehended and be locked up. So they are seen as illegal. So what do? We're able to now create a lab. When in doubt, you research the law. In Nigeria, we have 2 laws. I'll ask you to go check. Are there laws now? There's an act. There's a Cybersecurity Act. There's also the Nigeria's flavor of the GDPR, which is is General Data Protection Right. We have I think Nigeria National Data Protection Right. Well, we should read these documents. It just gives us a scope of what is allowed and what is not allowed. So in this topic, we'll install and explore a Kali Linux virtual machine that is full of popular ethical hacking tools. So there are some tools you might be using. Metasploit. Well, I think we have 3 tools, right? We have tools like Metasploit. We have Kali. Let me not. We have Wireshark, which is going to be used for analysis. We have Metasploit, which will be used for penetration testing, which is the attack itself. And those 2, we're going to be covering across them. So this particular virtual machine includes simulated internal IP networks that include a variety of intentionally vulnerable systems. So we're going to test them and see how they work. When it comes to penetration testing, a proper lab environment is very important. So you should invest in your own lab in your own house. The way this environment looks depends on the type of testing that you want to do, right? So the type of tools used in a lab also vary based on the different factors. Remember what we want to do. Are we testing application? If it's application, is it user application? Is it web application? Are we testing network? What kind of network? Is it the infrastructure network, the configurations of the infrastructure, the system infrastructure? Are we testing the hardware itself? What exactly are we testing? All of these things will depend on the kind of lab that you want to do. And then there are quite a number of areas in this. So whether you are performing penetration testing on a customer's network, on your own network, or a specific device, you always need some kind of lab environment to use for your testing. For example, when testing a customer's network, you would most likely be doing most of your testing against the customer's production network or staging environment, because these are the environments a customer is typically concerned about securing properly. So you may do it, but you don't do it during production time. That means perhaps like if you're in a school environment, right, or office environment, and they close by Friday, you can start your testing on Friday night and conclude on Saturday night because they resume work on Monday morning. So because this might be a critical network environment, you must be sure that your tools are tried and true. This is where your lab testing environment comes in. So you should always test your tools and techniques in your lab environment before you run them against any production network. There is no guarantee that the tools you will be using will not break something. In fact, many tools are designed for breaking things. So you therefore need to know what to expect before unleashing tools on customers' network. So you need your lab. Your lab is very important. Matter of fact, it's okay. Test it, try it, test it. So you need to invest a lot in a lab. You need to invest a lot in your own environment. And if you don't have it, only you, 4-5 people can come together, put money together and create their own lab. When testing a specific device or solution that is only in a lab environment, there is less concern about breaking things. So like a sandbox environment. With this type of testing, you could typically use a closed network that can easily be reverted if needed. Okay, so this is what we're going to be doing. We are launching, we're going to be launching this particular, we need for us to have a virtual machine installed. Right, so there are many different Linux distribution, or what we call distros, that include penetration testing tools, such as Kali. Kali is a distribution that is built for a lot of these kind of things. Parrot is another. Then there's blackark.org. Now, these are all Linux distros or distribution. They provide you with many convenient environments to start learning about different security tools and methodologies that are used in penetration testing or pen testing. So you can deploy a basic penetration testing lab using just a couple of VMs in virtual environment, such as VirtualBox or VMware Workstation. So these are the two, virtualbox.org or vmware.com. I noticed something is happening, some Python script, right? Recently, it's become very popular. I don't know. I was trying to solve one yesterday. And once I sort it out, I'll let us know, because maybe in trying to install your VirtualBox from virtualbox.org, you may encounter it. So we'll be able to find how to solve that out. So this figure here shows a VM1 running Parrot and another running a vulnerable Microsoft Windows system. So we're going to be having this kind of stuff, right? However, it's going to be virtual one. Two VMs are connected via virtual switch configuration and a host-only network. This type of setup allows you to perform different attacks and send IP packets between VMs without those packets leaving physical bare metal. Okay, so we don't have this physical thing here, but if you have the money, invest in it, buy it. Right, so this is what we're going to be having, the topology for penetration testing lab. So here's a pen tester. So you have your jump host, which is where you launch all of your attack. Of course, you have a virtual connection to these guys. And then this is your guy. Is your Kali, is your host that you'll be testing. So these are the two guys. And then you can have your different operating system. This is perhaps the system. These are the ones that you are testing, right? This is where you have to launch the attacks from. So server, Windows operating system, Mango database, and so on. You launch the attack and then get to find out how to run. So this is like an example. You invest in it. So here are certain requirements for penetration testing. Number one, closed network, meaning you should ensure that it's a controlled environment and it is restricted, right? Particularly with access to the internet. If person catch you, if your network enter dark web, you're on your own. Number two, virtualized computing environment where you have to deploy devices that you can actually delete instead of just having to delete a complete operating system, right? Realistic environment. If you are staging a testing environment, you should match the real environment as closely as possible. Health monitoring. When something crashes, you need to be able to determine why it happened. So you sit down and monitor the health of your process. Number four, sufficient hardware resources. You don't want to lack resources, right? You need to be sure that you have excess resources. What do we mean by resources? RAM, CPU, hard drive, network, those are resources. There are multiple operating systems. You want to be sure that you find a valid system that you want to test. It's always good to test from different operating systems to be certain. So get a great number of them, because operating systems have their own loopholes, they have their weaknesses, they have their vulnerabilities. They are not built with vulnerabilities, but of course, because these things evolve, the landscape of our network environment evolves. Some things that used to work some months before now become obsolete, and they pose a surface, an attack surface. Then duplicate tools. A great way to validate a finding is to run the same test with a different tool to see if the results are the same. As many tools as possible, right? Then practice targets. You need to practice using your tools. To do this, you need to practice on targets that are known to be vulnerable, right? So what tools should you use in your lab? Basically, the tools you use in penetration testing depend on the type of testing, which we've reiterated. If you are doing testing on a customer's network, you will likely be evaluating various attack surfaces. And it could be things like your network infrastructure, that's the physical network, there's wireless, perhaps have servers like your database servers, Windows servers, web servers, different operating systems like your Windows operating systems, Linux, and so on. So you want to be sure be sure that you have these things within your network. Then you need to have certain tools. There are a lot of tools that you can use, right? Tools like sniffing tools, manipulation tools, or tools that manipulate traffic, flooding applications. By that we mean applications that generate traffic, because typically the what you are testing is, if it's a network, right? You should understand that the architecture of the network is server client, which suggests that the client would always request server information from the server. So what is the conversation they are having? What is the structure of the conversation? What are the traffic that they send? So you want to be able to identify tools that can spoof or mimic these kind of conversations, right? Synchronization, acknowledgement, finish, reset, and all of those traffic. For wireless testing purposes, you might use tools for cracking wireless encryption, quite a number of them, right, that are available. So when testing web applications and services, you can find several automated tools built specifically for scanning and detecting web vulnerabilities. So yes, here's a caveat. Get these tools, but please don't be on the line. Don't be on internet running it, right? Because some of them are more or less baits. They are honeypots for the guy who developed them. Now, some of these tools can be used for tests for database vulnerabilities, like your SQL injection, right? For testing the server and client platform in an environment, you can use several automated scanning tools to identify things such as outdated software and misconfigurations, right? Outdated software are software that perhaps have expired, one, or have not been updated, two, or number three, have been cracked. Okay. With a lot of development targeting mobile platforms, there is an increasing need for testing these applications and the servers that support them. That's actually the next phase, because mobile devices with IoT devices are the next deployments that people are having, or that's the next phase. And it will be good to be prepared by the time those Wahala bursts. For such testing, you need another set of tools specific to testing mobile applications and the back-end application programming interface, or APIs, that they typically communicate with. And you should not forget about tools that do fuzzing, which are normally used for testing the robustness of protocol. So fuzzing tools are tools that you want to, also get familiar with, right? Then what if you break something? That's okay, right? It's very okay. You can, there's a lot of issues, but that's why we always advise that you do it in a production network. Except, of course, if you have the permission to increase the scope to the infrastructure itself. If that is the case, please do it when nobody's at work. It depends. If they have the time, or you think you can achieve it between a 12-hour window of when they close and when they resume the next day, fine. But I would always advise do it during the weekend. Start Friday, end on Sunday. Very, very important, right? Because if you go break something for a person office and they can't catch you, well, typically it's not like you be bad, right? You're not a bad guy. You're just some guy whose services were employed, right? For instance, when you are testing web application, some of the attacks that you send will impute very bogus information, fields that you don't need, things like data fields about maybe name, nomenclature, addresses, right? And they all end up in the database. So once they're in the database, there's a problem. So we want to ensure that you identify how to recover from things when you break them. It is also an issue, right, if you are working on the network without permission. So you must be ethical in your approach. But this is why we always say you should do it first. Test it in the lab. Have your lab. Test it in the lab. Without a quick recovery method, you would likely be stuck rebuilding your system under test. So if it is not possible, go back and test it in your lab. After all, what you are doing is penetration testing, right? So go back to the lab and do them. I think that brings us to the end of today's class, and that's that. This is a wrap of what we just talked about. Ethical hacker is someone who uses the same tool as a non-ethical hacker to find vulnerabilities in a network or system structure, but report their findings. The purpose of penetration testing is to identify possible paths of compromise and then report them, normally before the attacker does. It is important to evaluate and test the effectiveness of defensive techniques used to secure and defend networks and systems, and this is where penetration testing comes in. Some types of threats are organized crimes, hacktivists, state-sponsored attackers, and then insider threats. It is important to use a methodology for penetration testing so that you can avoid creep and to provide penetration testing and so on. So I think this is how much I can take before my battery goes off so that we don't just go to an anticlimax. However, it's part of the recording, so you can always go. So I've been able to scroll to the next page. So of course, there must be certain standards and you must follow those standards so that you are known as somebody who is ethical. These standards are worldwide and they are considered acceptable. So with that, that is all we have for today. Are there any questions?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. A quick one.
All right.
Since thank God you spoke about even trying to set up this lab,
yep.
it will require it takes resources.
Yes.
And I know that VirtualBox takes a lot of resources, and because it's actually using maybe an hypervisor and the system is actually what is hosting it. So can we go the route of the cloud to get VMs and set up labs instead of using the VirtualBox concept? Because I know for most people, depending on the strength of your system, otherwise it might be very, very slow.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes, going the way of cloud or doing it the VirtualBox way.
No, okay, so either which way. Again, it depends on what works for you, right? And when I mean what works for you is with regards to resources that you have. And by resources, I say money. In money day, I would advise build your own, right? Because if it is cloud, you must identify. I'm not saying that they are bad, though, but let me tell you, what you don't have control over, you don't have control over, right? And in this field, I want you to treat everybody as a suspect, both the cloud guys, just like they are treating you as a suspect. Because it's possible that I could contact a cloud guy and I am a bad guy. And the idea is just to be able to enter their own network. So, but it's not, I'm not discouraging that. It is an option, right? And of course, as much as possible, AWS platforms have some of those kind of stuff. Azure, Microsoft have some platforms like that. And you can go ahead and, get access to them and practice pending when money come. One deal go show. That's my prayer for one deal go show. You will land enough BEMU. Once BEMU show, you can actually go ahead and create. Now, I would say as a caveat, instead of going the way of the cloud, I'm certain that perhaps you are colleagues or friends with some of these people that are in this class, even if otherwise maybe in your own circle. Put money together. Don't rush in creating your lab. Take your time until you get these resources to build your lab in your own place, because you can do a lot of stuff without being checked. Those platforms, those virtual guys, have certain limitations to what you can achieve. For those who do DevOps, that's a great number of what most people that do develop. There's GitHub and there's some other platforms like that. Most of them don't have the environment in their place. They don't have the resources to build that lab in their own place. So they normally yield to some of those online platforms. So it's cool until you get the resources. So yeah.
Okay, good one. The second one, hope we'll get a copy of this slide you've used. I think a lot of people have asked about that.
Sure.
You get it. Of this which you have used today.
Yeah, you will.
All right,
I'll give it to you. Yeah, you're welcome. So, Engineer M.A. Suleiman, my battery will soon die. I know what in Nigeria they talk now. Someone I know vex. If the battery go off, then I say class don't finish, battery don't go. Go ahead, engineer.
Hello.
Yes, sir. Hello, sir.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah, mine is just an appreciation. We really appreciate your presentation, and you are really good at what you are doing. And
thank you, sir.
We thank God for having you here as our mentor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
And
I appreciate
kindly please share a slide with us so that we can go through and learn more. If possible, we need your contact so that or your email so that we can share what we have done, so that if there is a guide, you can guide us. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm sure your battery must have gone off.
I believe the class is over now. See you all tomorrow.
May we all solicit that we have the slides of this class?
Yes, he heard it. He heard it, and then we also dropped it as a chat message for him. Tomorrow too, we'll still have during tomorrow's class, we can still go ahead to remind him. Yeah.
Do we have a class rep?
Let's go back to WhatsApp and discuss this. This is just for this link is just for a lecture. So let us go back to WhatsApp group so that we can discuss this and see if we can
Okay, engineer.
our chair. So wish you all the best. Bye-bye.
Good night.